Thank you all for coming, especially newcomers. We have a lot of different programs run here we have almost every kind of person at HSGP running some sort of thing some sort of project or event often that they are passionate about. And so please feel free to join us on Meetup and see what shows up on your calendar. Also, speaking of which, people following their passions, I wanted to give a shout out to our Service and Participation Director, Mars Delatour, at that table back there. They have just won an award from the American Humanism Association, and I actually wrote it down because otherwise I'm not going to get it right. The Heart of Humanism Award for Outstanding Leaders. And they are planning on going to the annual Humanism Conference in Denver next month, and we do have a GoFundMe on our Facebook page for raising the funds to help cover gas, hotel, meals, and stuff to send them there. And to represent us as well. So, congratulations, Mars. So, on to our guests. 22 days ago, I emailed them and said, hey, you want to speak to us over Zoom sometime? We'd really love to have you as a Sunday speaker. And within 5 minutes, I had an email from Clementine going, hey, we're going to be in town. Can we do the 16th? And I said, no, blood drive. Like I said, we've always got stuff going on here. But tonight we are doing snacks, cocktails, social hour, and an introduction to cancel culture. They are on a road trip. They are from Quebec. They are in their car. Their dog Clover is at my house right now, resting in the air-conditioned environment, and wondering why my cats don't want to play with her. And so we're really excited to host them here, because this was just very, very fast. And I'm going to introduce it kind of like as if I were Father Jack from Ireland. But I would like to welcome the hosts of Fecking Cancelled to speak to us all about Cancel Culture 101.
Thanks so much. You want to grab this one?
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you to the Humanist Society for hosting us. It's actually very cool how it turned out, because we are currently on a tour and we are like touring across America, and a fan of the podcast had reached out to us and asked us if we would come to Phoenix, and we were like, sure, like we could come to Phoenix, like it's like kind of on our route, so we were planning on doing that, but then we didn't really get a lot of interest, and so we were going to drop Phoenix because we were like, it doesn't seem like we have any fans of Phoenix. Like this one person was kind of like, yeah, come to Phoenix, but like when we advertised it, like we didn't really have a lot of interest, so we were like, okay, probably not going to do Phoenix. And then we got this email being like, hey, like do you want to come and do a talk at like the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix? And we were like, weird. Like we were thinking of coming to Phoenix, so this actually turned out really amazing because there's lots of people here and we're really excited to be able to do this in Phoenix.
Yeah, we're super happy to be here. Is this on?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, and so, yeah, we're really stoked to be here. We have never been to a desert before. It's crazy. There's cactuses.
Cactuses are cool.
Really big.
Yeah.
That we had no idea about. And yeah, that's been wild. We've also been driving for like 4 days straight from like Oklahoma, which was our last stop. So
Yeah.
we are a little bit out of it, but we had a great sleep last night at Catherine's place.
Yeah.
So we're really stoked about that.
So I guess we'll tell you a little bit about the podcast, because I guess not everyone here knows about the podcast. So basically we have a podcast. It's called Fucking Cancelled. And we do swear a lot, so thank you for being accommodating of that. We are leftists, we are queer people, we come out of social justice culture, and we are concerned with the phenomenon of cancel culture that is happening inside our communities and our scenes. And so we have a podcast in which we talk about cancel culture from a leftist perspective. And why we don't like cancel culture. And so we're going to unpack a bunch of that for you guys today to give you more of an understanding about, first of all, what cancel culture is, and second of all, why we don't like it.
Yeah.
Okay, so should we just jump into it?
I believe we should.
Okay, so first of all, it's important for us to position ourselves on the left. And so what we mean by that is that, basically to put it in the simplest terms possible, like my fundamental values is that all people should have what they need to thrive in life. People should have access to housing, healthcare, they should have access to education, they should have access to public transit, they should have access to, you know, what are some of the other good ones? Like food, yes, food, they should have access to food.
Yeah, nutritious food and an environment that they can live in and that their children will also be able to live in.
Yeah, so those are like our values, and then also along with that, like people should be able to be who they are. People should be able to freely express who they are, and we should be living in a world that like can promote and tolerate a diversity of perspectives and ways of living and being. So like to us, that's what it basically means to be a leftist, like in the simplest, like in the sense of values.
Yeah, and so we are interested in trying to find a way to build a left that is actually able to either take power or influence power in order to get regular people the things that they need. Because right now, especially in the United States, but also in Canada, there's like a right wing and like an extreme far right wing, and that's kind of a bad situation for like regular, ordinary people who are trying to work and survive. So since we're trying to build a left that is worthy of the name, we need to think about the obstacles in our way, right? There are many obstacles in the way to a functional left, but a huge one is cancel culture and the way that it has been just like decimating the left for the past, well, a while now, but it's definitely been picking up steam in the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and like basically, you know, if you look for the critiques of cancel culture, if you've heard of cancel culture and you're like, what is cancel culture? Or maybe you think cancel culture isn't great and you're trying to like look up about that, you're gonna find the right talking about this a lot. And so the right is talking about it, but then the right is often at the same time kind of against a lot of the things that I started out by saying we are for, right? And so it's really important that there is a leftist opposition to cancel culture, because what ends up happening is that if someone gets canceled, you know, and we're going to talk about what that means, but if someone gets canceled, they're going to go out there and they're going to look for an explanation of what's happening to them. They're going to start Googling. And what's going to come up for them is a whole bunch of right-wing people who are saying, yeah, cancel culture is real and what happened to you is wrong, but they're also going to be saying a bunch of other stuff, like, I don't know, that they don't like gay people or something like that, you know? And so
Did you say that?
And we like gay people. So, yeah, so we want people to be able to find a leftist explanation for why cancel culture is a problem as part of like what we're trying to do with these events and with the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, another thing that I like to point out is that the right, although they currently have an almost monopoly on the critique of cancel culture, you know, very often have a mode of interacting with the world that is like fundamentally based on censoring people and you know, deeming certain people to be unworthy of full humanity, and therefore they kind of love cancel culture. They just don't call it that, you know.
Right.
So yeah, like a lot of the time, the critiques coming from like the right wing of the Republican Party or the Conservative Party in Canada are sort of like in very bad faith, because it's all stuff that they would love to be doing to others, but they don't like it when it happens to them, right?
Right.
And so what we want to point out is we want to say that like our leftist, like socialist values preclude cancel culture for us. Like we think that they fundamentally do not interact.
Yes.
And so we want to be able to use our understanding of socialist and left-wing values to explain to people why cancel culture is completely like not working.
And like I'm new to like secular humanism. I didn't know too much about that before this, but like from, you know, reading the commitments and stuff, I think there's a lot of alignment with the values that you guys are expressing here. So I think this is a great setting for us to be doing this talk. So I guess we should get into what is cancel culture.
Let's.
So basically, to put it in the simplest terms, what cancellation is. First I'll talk about cancellation and what it means to be canceled, and then I'll talk about cancel culture. So cancellation is a targeted harassment campaign against a person in which that person is accused of something or is marked as having done something wrong. Often it's described as they've caused harm in some way, and there could be like a whole bunch of different accusations. But this person has been called out. Sometimes these accusations are true, sometimes they're not true. But what happens is this person has now been marked as bad. And so through that, first of all, there is a process of dehumanization in which empathy is now revoked from this person. You're no longer allowed to feel empathy for them because they have been marked as bad. And if we care about social justice, we should therefore want to basically punish and exile this person. And so the harassment campaign targets the individual who has been accused, but it also targets any person who has a relationship of any kind with the accused. And so what will happen is that it now becomes a punishable offense to be in any kind of relationship with the accused. And so like that could be, you know, even just like following them on social media or like being a fan of their work, all the way down to like being a close personal friend of theirs or like their partner, right? And so we have situations and like, you know, we both are canceled, just to full disclosure, but also like we know hundreds of canceled people now through this work. And so we've heard all the stories, but basically like people will literally be harassed into like leaving their long-term committed partner, you know? And they will, if you refuse to abandon the person, you receive the same amount of harassment that the target is getting. Like you can be canceled for not taking part in the cancellation.
Yeah, and we should point out right off the bat that often when we hear about cancel culture in like the mainstream media and so on, and especially when it's criticisms that are that are coming from the right, it tends to be focused on like celebrities or like some like comedian or like an actor or something like that, or even sometimes Republicans like to pretend that they're canceling like M&Ms or like some shit like that. But we're talking about like individuals, like almost always like private individuals, like who are like regular working class people who have been involved either in like an activist scene in some way, or they are trying to be artists or writers, or they are even just like in the sort of like lefty world, like a little bit more broadly. And so these people are the kinds of people who we don't hear anything about on the media. There's no news stories about them. It's just people who become sort of like scapegoated from their communities, right? And then often they tend to disappear completely because what ends up happening to those people is that it becomes impossible for them to maintain any relationships with anyone. Like very few people will stand by you if you are really truly like brutally canceled, because it becomes dangerous to do so, because the cancellation then starts to extend to you. And so in this way people become almost like infectious, right? Mm-hmm. This is like one of the main mechanisms of a cancellation, where like if you're canceled and you hang out with somebody, that person has to either like denounce you or leave you like in the dust, or else they will also be like next, like in line. And often, like when we explain this to people who are not necessarily like super engaged in like social justice world, it sounds really insane, because it is, but it is also really real. And people who are really enmeshed in that world like completely understand what we're talking about, because they've seen it happen to like a couple of people, or maybe like dozens of people, or maybe it's happened to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, through this process of cancellation, like I'm not exaggerating when I say. I'm not exaggerating when I say that people can, in like one fell swoop, lose basically all their relationships in their life. Like they can lose all their close, important relationships. Also, like, sometimes, and actually like more often than you would think, the accusations are not true, or they're like an overstatement, or they're like it's being misconstrued, and there is no opportunity for the accused person to state their side of things, because basically under the framework of cancel culture, like when you've been accused, you have to accept the accusations against you, and to say like that this doesn't represent what happened is like seen as causing further harm, right? And so people are put in a pretty crazy situation, because if you're being accused of something that you didn't do, or that is a total misrepresentation of what happened, like to give a concrete example, like say you're in conflict with someone, you're going through like a breakup and you guys are fighting, and like you're both kind of like in conflict and not acting like your best self, and then the person comes out and says, all of these accusations that aren't actually representative of what happened. If you say like, hey, this isn't representative of what happened, and like here's my side of things, which like I'm sure if any of us have ever seen a couple go through a messy breakup, they both have sides of things, right? They would both probably describe this in a different way, but if the accusation has been made that this person has done something harmful, now saying your side of things is just positioned as further harm. So there's like no possibility to defend yourself. And also, even if you try to do the approach of like taking accountability, which is like what is demanded of canceled people, that they should take accountability, whether they agree with the accusations or not, If you do that, if you come forward and say publicly on the internet, I've been accused of these things, I did these things, and I'm really sorry, that also isn't a way back. That also isn't a way for the cancellation to now end, right? So there is no way back. The harassment doesn't end. I'm hearing like weird sounds.
Yeah, what is that? 'Cause I don't know what that is.
It's a loud party.
Okay. Well, cool.
All right.
We're vibing with it.
Okay, yeah, I got like so distracted there. I was gonna say something and it was important.
We're talking about cancellation. Wow, yeah, it's really loud out there.
Hey, we need to cancel that party.
Oh yeah, okay, I remember what I was gonna say. I'm just gonna talk louder and pretend that there's not a bunch of music. Some of you who may be escapees from more, like the more intense kind of fundamentalist religion or cult might note that this sounds exactly like shunning, which is something that happens in a lot of like religious communities where if you are accused of something that's sort of like heretical or beyond the bounds of the like accepted worldview of that community, you can be either forced to go through a process where you sort of like talk about how sorry you are and how you see the light again or whatever, or forced out, right? And like people who continue to associate with you can be subject to the same kind of censure. So it's something that happens not only on the left, not only in the social justice world, but like all throughout, we think, like all throughout sort of like human society. But we are, particularly interested in how it impacts the left because that's where we position ourselves.
Yeah. And so now I just want to say, what is it about the culture part, right? Because we talked about cancellation, so what makes it a culture? Why do we call it cancel culture? And the reason for this is because cancellation, while it totally devastates, the people who have been targeted and everyone around them, like, it also impacts everyone else who is witnessing this, right? It creates a culture in which people are afraid of being canceled. And so it depends, if you're not super inside this world, you're kind of like, what? Like, this is like, I think we're talking to an audience that's maybe mixed, where some people are inside this world and are like nodding, and then there's other people who are like, I have not heard of this. But if you're inside of this world, and like, I'm a queer person, it's very intense in queer world, you are watching it happen all around you all the time. And so you are seeing people in your community go from being like, someone that people like and are friends with, to all of a sudden they are blacklisted. And they are suddenly treated as untouchable, and you watch them just getting taken down, and you yourself are implicated. Like, you yourself are expected to withdraw. And if you don't, you're being threatened that you are also going to get canceled. And so it creates an environment in which people are quite paranoid, in which people are anxious. They don't feel like they can speak freely. They feel like everything that they say is being watched and put under a microscope, because any misstep could result in a call out and could result in a cancellation. And so obviously, this is very stressful, and it erodes many things that I think the humanist society would hold dear, such as the capacity for critical thinking, right? You can't think critically if you're being told that there's like a right and a wrong way to think about things, and that stepping out of line is going to result in a spectacle of punishment, right? It also erodes community and relationships, because how are you supposed to have close, trustworthy friendships when you're watching people in your community be treated as utterly disposable, like on the regular, right? It creates an environment where you don't actually feel like you belong, that you can actually like trust your friends and community to like have your back if you are ever targeted.
Yeah, so this environment of fear and self-censorship and people like really like watching their step like the whole time and really like walking on eggshells has obvious downsides for, well, yeah, as Clementine was saying, like our capacity to think critically, our ability to build good relationships, and to be to feel safe in ourselves and with one another. So it's definitely a big issue, and like and so we also want to talk about what cancel culture like isn't, right? Because I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. A lot of people are sort of like, oh, so you're saying that like I can't have like boundaries, or like I can't if I don't like somebody, I have to keep hanging out with them or something, or like if somebody hurt me, like I have to forgive them and be their friend. And it's like, no, like cancel culture isn't any of those things, right? Like if you don't like someone, don't hang out with them. It's fine, you know. And if you need to have a boundary about something because someone has, you know, done something that you really disagree with, or has like actively gone out of their way to hurt you for some reason, like you should have a boundary. A boundary is a really important thing. You don't have to be spending time with people who you really can't get along with, or who have like, you know, who have injured you or harmed you in some way. There's no reason for you to do that. But that is different, right, from purposefully starting like a campaign of harassment that extends to like the friends and loved ones and like the workplace, and like even like, you know, trying to get someone kicked out of the home they live in by contacting their roommates, like this kind of thing, which is like where cancellation campaigns can end up at, right? It's a very different kind of orientation towards that individual to say like, I don't want to hang out with you anymore, versus saying none of your friends can hang out with you anymore.
Right.
Right? Which is where it usually ends up.
Yeah. So now we just want to sort of emphasize the main reasons why we don't like cancel culture, which might be kind of clear from what we've just said. But the first is that cancel culture like has an absolutely devastating impact on human beings. And like it is, I cannot emphasize enough what a traumatic experience it is to be misrepresented and dehumanized and painted as a two-dimensional evil caricature all over the internet, to receive like a incredible influx of harassing messages telling you, you know, that you are a piece of shit, that you are garbage, that you did all of these things that you may or may not have done, and also that you deserve everything that's happening to you. It's horrible. That would be very stressful in general, but while this is happening, you are losing everything that a person needs to go through a situation like that. You are losing all your closest relationships. You are losing your hopes and dreams. You are losing potentially your job. You're definitely losing, if you had any kind of creative pursuits, you're losing that. In some cases, you're losing your housing. I lost my housing. I had to move. And so to actually experience all of that simultaneously, it puts people at a very high risk of suicide. And this is very serious. And like we, because of the work that we do, are just absolutely flooded with messages from canceled people who are experiencing this extremely overwhelming and traumatic event, and who have been cut off from empathy. So if they try to say, hey guys, like, I'm really struggling right now, people will just be like, you're centering yourself, you're causing more harm, you know? So there is no empathy. And so to experience that and to have no empathy from anyone is like just so profoundly being pushed outside of the human community, you know? And so they come to us because we continue to humanize them. And so like we get their stories, and it is absolutely devastating and brutal. So that is one of the main and most fundamental reasons why we do this work. And we receive a lot of harassment for doing this work, because you're not supposed to stand up for cancel people. But we believe that all human beings are human beings, and they deserve empathy, you know? And the other thing I want to say about this, before we move on to the second reason, but I think this is connected to the first reason, is that, because I know when I talk about this, in the back of people's minds, people are thinking, okay, but what about people who did something really bad, right? And so I want to address that. People who did something really bad, first of all, are still human beings, right? They still don't deserve to die. They should not be stripped of all of their resources until they're like pushed to the point of suicide. And secondly, and I think this is a very important pragmatic point, is that if we want to transform very serious harms such as abuse, you know, we actually need to be resourcing people, not stripping them of resources. And so if you listen to the podcast, which hopefully you will, if you haven't already, one of the things that Jay and I draw a lot of our perspectives from is that both of us are alcoholics who went through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so like in AA, it's a totally different worldview. In AA, you get people coming in there who are all fucked up, who are all sketchy, who have done horrible things. You know, I'm sure many of you know an alcoholic who has acted completely insane and completely inappropriately and has perhaps done like some really bad things. I know a lot of those people. And in 12 steps, instead of people saying, fuck you, You're a piece of shit, you're garbage, we're gonna take away all your relationships and everything that you love until you're accountable, and then even then, we're not gonna give it back to you. Like, because that's what cancel culture does. In 12 steps, you know, the way that I was treated when I came in, like I was a street involved alcoholic crazy person for like 9 years, you know? And when I came into the program, I was treated with compassion, welcome, people shook my hand, they gave me coffee, they gave me cookies, they sat me down, they talked to me about my life. And they asked me what was wrong. Why was I acting so crazy? Why was I hurting people like this, you know? And they gave me what I needed to change. And it is through those relationships that I changed, you know? And because I've been in those rooms, I have watched people change. I have seen people come in who have held up a store at gunpoint, you know? Who have terrorized people in their lives for years and years and years. And I have watched them change. I have seen them become responsible members of their communities who are making the coffee, shaking people's hands, who are now being welcomed back into the social world, you know? And so that's what we believe in. That's what we believe is the way to address serious shit. And that doesn't mean that you can never like intervene or that you can never have boundaries with people who are acting in ways that are hurting others. But ultimately, if we want to transform abuse and other serious types of harm, we can only do so by offering compassion, resources, and the things that people need to change.
Yeah, and I work for a homeless shelter. I've been working for homeless shelters for the past while now, and I do street intervention. So I walk around with a backpack and I like meet people where they're at, and I try to find out what resources they need and give them to them. You know, and often the people who I have to go meet on the street are people who can't come in to the shelter because they're so fucked up for various reasons. You know, and invariably, like 100% of people who are chronically homeless have like a severely traumatic background, like all of them, you know. They were abused horrifically as children, they were like really badly neglected, they did not have resources and care when they needed them, and it caused, you know, the kind of trauma that causes someone to be under an overpass, you know, sparing for change or whatever it is. And I know from my work, but also from my experience with 12 steps and so on, that the more resources you take away from somebody, the more likely they are to end up in terrible situations, often hurting people, definitely hurting themselves. And the way to reverse that is to give them resources, almost always. Now, that can be very difficult to stomach if it's someone who has hurt you, right? But the good news is, if someone has hurt you, you're not the one who has to give them resources. Like, the whole point of, at least for me, the whole point of being a socialist is to understand that, like, the society can give people resources. And it doesn't have to be an individual doing it to someone that they don't like, you know? I don't have to like you. And, I mean, as we say sometimes, you know, I don't have to like you, I don't have to like you, I just have to love you. And we sort of believe in that on like a social level, right? Yeah, and so, yeah, cancel culture on an individual level does the opposite of that. It takes resources away from people as much as possible, and can even extend to people justifying, you know, violently assaulting people and that kind of thing in the name of punishment. We here at Fucking Cancelled are very much against punishment, and so we don't think that it works strategically, and we don't think that it makes sense ethically. Now, the second reason why we would oppose cancel culture as socialists is that it is destroying the left. It is destroying the capacity of the left to build power. Yeah, and when I say the left, you know, we talked about it a little bit, but I'm not talking about like, I mean, a lot of people have a kind of, I would say, kind of confused idea of what the left even means. I just want to have a movement of working class people who can challenge capital. And like that's all that I want. I'm willing to work with practically anybody who has that same goal. And like I really wish that we would stop like schisming ourselves into tinier and tinier groups when we have that goal. But one thing that we have seen over the past while on the left is that the phenomenon of cancel culture has just taken off to such a degree that like almost every like socialist or leftist or anarchist organization that we have seen has like imploded, like very often really dramatically as a result of cancellation spectacles. Now that like obviously sucks on just like an organizational level, like when people who are just trying to like do good work and happen to be messy, like almost every one of us, get sort of targeted in this very sort of like dramatic and over the top way. Also, if we are concerned about, as some of us might be concerned about infiltration by the police or something like that, it becomes very, very easy for security services to disrupt like any kind of left-wing organizing by just sort of pointing a finger at somebody and being like, that one, you know? And they can be taken down very easily by false accusations or real accusations that get turned into a reason to destroy their life completely.
Yeah, like cancel culture has created this sort of like belief that is just sort of taken as self-evident that you shouldn't organize with people who have ever done anything wrong in their life. You know, that you should organize with people who are like morally pure. And I'm like, real people are messy and real people have complicated life histories. Most of us would probably not stand up to that level of scrutiny if all of our private like stories were just put on the internet, you know? And my idea as a leftist is that, you know, obviously we don't want fucked up things happening in our movement spaces, but like, yes, I'm willing to organize with anybody who's willing to organize with me towards the same ends, as long as we're not like disrespecting each other in the space and we're willing to work together. Like, yes, I'm willing to work with people who've done fucked up things. Because lots of people have, and people aren't perfect, and we're not going to agree on everything, but we do need to find ways to work together. And I just want to say about this that like, one of the things is like, I like offered to do free consults with like leftists who were dealing with cancel culture, like leftist organizers. And it was crazy, like the influx that I got. And I was doing these Zoom meetings with leftist organizers. And you know what was the majority of them were environmentalists who were trying to fight climate change. And they were coming to me to be like, our organizations are imploding due to these cancellation spectacles. And many of them had totally splintered and were now like, we are the remnants of like this once formerly robust environmentalist group that has completely eaten itself alive. And so like environmentalists, you know, many of them are dealing with like facing police or doing direct action and like they're dealing with a lot of stressful stuff. But their biggest threat was like themselves and each other and the fact that they were unable to organize because they kept canceling each other. And so yeah, take this very seriously because climate change is an existential threat, you know, and I see on your commitments over here that you guys care about this. And I think that like we absolutely need to be organizing effectively about climate change and other things as well, but especially climate change. And it's very hard to do so when our organizations are constantly imploding from the inside due to cancellation spectacles.
Yeah. Also, like really briefly, I want to note that apparently the Unitarians are currently like experiencing like an insane schism where like they're like completely falling apart, and it's like all over like a cancellation spectacle about like identity-based like like arguments, and you know the Unitarians are, you know, I think somewhat in the same league as like the Humanist Society in the sense that it's, you know, kind of people just trying to do good work in the world without being too dogmatic about it. And it's very unfortunate that these organizations that are trying to, you know, just to do good things in the world are finding themselves constantly falling apart for this reason.
Yeah, so in the interest of time, I feel like we need to kind of power through this next bit.
Yeah.
Because we talked a lot, we do this. But so this is Cancel Culture 101. We just gave you Cancel Culture 101. We want to just dip our toes into Cancel Culture 102. And definitely for this, it's like we really do recommend that you guys listen to the podcast to go deeper into some of these concepts because these are big concepts that it's going to be hard for us to unpack in a half an hour, but we'll do our best. So just very briefly, like, on our podcast, we talk about cancel culture, but we talk about cancel culture as one piece of a larger something that we call the nexus. But you might also call this social justice culture or social justice orthodoxy. Some people call it, I guess they call it being woke, or like there's different names, social justice warrior, people call it whatever. Basically, it is a subculture, it is a way of thinking that is progressive and is about it's ostensibly left. Say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, basically when we were trying to theorize this, because, you know, basically we both got canceled and we'd seen it happen to like a whole bunch of people and we're like, why is this happening? Like, what is going on here? And we're trying to theorize it and we're trying to like understand it a bit more. You know, I have an anthropology background, so I was sort of like, how does this work? Why are people doing this? Like, what is the sort of like human background of this, you know? And something that we kept coming up against was that it's not just cancel culture, because like cancel culture is basically scapegoating, but on, like writ large, right?
Yeah.
And scapegoating exists all over the place and always has, right? But what like kind of makes this different than just scapegoating, right? And we basically came to the conclusion that there are actually like three things operating, and they kind of come together into this like intersection, and that intersection is what we just call the nexus because we needed like a name for it, you know. And something that's interesting about social justice culture is that it kind of doesn't really name itself.
Yes,
it
it
just
doesn't
kind of
name
says like this is the right thing to do, you know. And
we're
we were
gonna get
like,
into that.
yeah, we will get into that. But we needed a name for it, a kind of placeholder name, so we just called it the nexus, and that kind of stuck, and that's what we called it on the podcast. But the three elements of the nexus are cancel culture, which we've just covered, and the other two are social media and then identitarianism. And so we're gonna cover social media kind of quickly.
Very briefly.
But one of the things is that cancel culture plays out mostly on social media. Now, it definitely leaks into what we could call real life, like in sometimes extremely dramatic ways, right? Like if you lose your housing or something, that is definitely real life, right? But a lot of it is happening on social media. Like a lot of the actual like sort of content of it is happening on social media. You know, in our generation, like virtually every single person is on social media. And if you're trying to sort of like get out there in any kind of way, let's say you want to be a writer or you're like an activist of some sort or whatever, you almost definitely have a social media platform, which can be used to target you, right? Say more about social media.
Okay, yeah, I'm just gonna say this really, really briefly. So basically, like, before social media, we kind of had this weird deal with celebrities where we were like, you guys get millions of dollars, and then in exchange, we're gonna like dehumanize you and like use your social lives as entertainment in the tabloids, right? And we're gonna violate your privacy, and we're gonna consume your like personhood as entertainment, but you're gonna get millions of dollars, so that's the trade-off, you know? And we're all familiar with that. We see the tabloids and the way that we talk really weird about celebrities, and we like invade their privacy and whatever. Social media has now expanded this way of relating to regular people, but without the millions of dollars, right? And so now, because of social media, we all have like a presence on the internet, right? And we all feel entitled to know things about people's personal lives and to like weigh in on what we think about a person on the internet. And so it's a very weird and dehumanizing way of relating, and it results in regular people who do not have millions of dollars, who are not celebrities, having what amounts to, you know, personal drama in their lives, right? Being blown up at levels that we could never have imagined before, where people have this being witnessed by thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, right?
Yeah, and something about the internet in general, which, you know, I'm sure everyone is familiar with, is the concept of virality, and because something can go viral, right? And so it could be like a meme or whatever, but it can also be a person, right? And within sort of like activist communities, or sometimes even just within like a city, you know, like it happens to some guy in New York, like basically like random people, if their cancellation spectacle, for some reason, it has some quality to it that makes it extra kind of juicy, it can go viral and then be seen by, like thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people,
yeah.
Which is insane if you were just one person, right? Like, you're not a celebrity, you're not an actor or whatever, you're just like some guy, and then all of a sudden there are like 790,000 people who like know your name, know what you look like, and know like this crazy story about you that may or may not even be true, right?
Yeah.
So this is like a deeply like worrying thing, a very concerning thing that happens to you, obviously.
And so the one last thing I'll say before we move on, because we gotta move on from social media, but the last thing I'll say is that what this does as well is that it means that it's not just local, right? Before, if you were canceled in your like town and everybody decided they hated you in your town, you could move somewhere else. But now, because of the internet, these accusations follow people. We know people who have left cities, countries, and continents to try to get away from their cancellation, and it follows them. Because people find out where they live now, and they spread the accusations to the city that they're currently living in, and they make sure that every person in their new life now knows the accusations. So because of social media, it's basically impossible to get away from it.
Yeah, I'm gonna actually keep talking about social media for a second.
We have no time for that.
We do for a second. And the one thing I wanted to say was just that, like, because it then ends up being spread by so many different people, because the numbers can get so high on the internet, it necessarily spreads to people who have no connection whatsoever to the original stories, right? And they're often making things up because they don't know the people involved, or the stories can just become like
broken telephone.
With each telling, they change like a little bit, you know, and they almost always will get worse, right? Because if they get less bad, then they're less likely to be spread, right? It's kind of like evolution, if any of you are familiar with Charles Darwin.
Okay, so now we're going to just move on to identitarianism, because identitarianism is sort of like the more
The juiciest bit.
it's controversial and difficult to unpack, and so we probably wish we had more time to talk about it, but we'll do our best. Okay, so identitarianism, what is it? First of all, identitarianism is not the same thing as identity politics. Often those two things are used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Identity politics is basically the idea that when we have social movements, we should keep in mind that people have different experiences, and so we should include that in our social movements. So for example, we should not assume that every single person in our social movement has the experience of a heterosexual white man, right? We should understand that people's social locations shape their lives, and we should account for that when we are doing politics. We have no problem with that. Identity politics is fine. But identitarianism takes this to a different level.
Yeah, so identitarianism is a hyper-focus on identity at the expense of every other factor. And particularly in the context of a sort of political movement, but this can also be applied to everyday life. And I'm sure that many of us are seeing this more and more over the past decade or so. I think that identitarianism has become very, very, very common as a way of understanding the world. What it essentially does is it says that identity, particularly the kinds of identities that are sometimes called ascriptive identities, which is like race, gender, sexual orientation, like things that people sort of assign to you, like rather than say like someone who enjoys golf, like that's not the kind of identity that we're talking about, you know? It's the belief that identity is the major driving force of history, of politics, of everything that is important. It's the most important way of understanding an individual. It's the most important way of understanding how society works, right? And just using identity as a stand-in for like almost any other factor that you can imagine, particularly class, which is not an identity, it's a relationships and reproduction. Yeah, so that's what identitarianism is and how it fits into cancel culture.
Yeah, okay. And so basically in social justice culture, what you will get as a result of identitarianism is that you will see people basically starting to list their identities all the time. You will see that people will begin what they're saying with a list of identities, and they will list out all the marginalized identities that they have, and now they'll also sometimes be listing like the privileged identities that they have. And this is a way of thinking about power that assumes that we can understand what a person's life has been like by basically tallying up the points of the different identities, right? So a person will say, you know, like I am like a white woman, but I'm queer and I am disabled, right? So you have some privilege points and some marginalized points, and then through this we're supposed to have an understanding of what your life has been like. But this is a vast oversimplification that cannot account for the reality of people's lives, because there are many, many, many factors, including identity, but not just identity, that shape people's lives. And so it's very important to keep that in mind. And so then basically what ends up happening is that through this basically collection of identity points and this like weighing out of identity points, we get people leveraging identity as a way of grounding their arguments or justifying what they're saying, right? And so we are expected to legitimize, when I say this, I'm talking about in the context of social justice culture. I'm not saying that this is happening elsewhere. This is definitely not happening with right-wing people, where listing a bunch of marginalized identities is going to get you taken more seriously. But within social justice culture, this is what's happening. And so you can say, I'm making this argument, I'm grounding it in these identities, and therefore you are not allowed to disagree with me because you don't have those identities. And so that is like deference. It's the idea that we should defer to people based on which marginalized identities they have or don't have. And this can go to some really weird places, because you will basically get people squabbling and arguing about who is more marginalized in a given situation based on which identities they have and which one is more oppressed or less oppressed.
Right, or like taking two competing like ideas or views of something, or like ideas about what we should be doing or something, and weighing them not based on the content of the ideas, which would seem to be the more obvious thing to do, but rather based on the identities of the people who hold those ideas, right? Which I think you can probably imagine could end up in some kind of wacky places.
And an important piece that I really need to emphasize about this is that although in social justice culture, people will say you need to center the voices of whatever marginalized identity, they actually are not centering the voices of the people in that identity. They're centering the voices of the people in that identity who are saying the social justice orthodoxy, right? Because if I'm gonna say, you know, let's center like the voices of gay people, right? if you actually meet gay people, they don't think the same things as each other. There is.
It'd be really weird if they did.
It would be really weird if they did. So basically, what I'm trying to get at is that this identitarian deference thing produces essentialism. It produces the idea that populations, which include millions and sometimes billions of people, can be flattened so that we could make a statement like, this is what the LGBT community thinks, or this is what the BIPOC community thinks, or this is what the trans community thinks, or whatever, right? You actually cannot make a statement like that because each one of those like umbrella terms includes millions and billions of people, and if you actually went out and talked to a sampling of those people outside of social justice orthodoxy, you would find that they all think vastly different things and disagree with each other.
Right, and what it ends up implying is that those populations of people, which can include huge numbers of people, have something essential about them that makes them believe all the same thing, right? Which is, I mean, in my view, it's like a very like prejudiced thing to think, right? And it also ends up giving you like this weird position where people in a given identity group, let's say like queer people, or you could say black people, or like whatever group you want to think of, are not allowed to have their own internal politics.
Yes.
Right? Because it's just like, we're saying like, okay, like black people believe that like this should be true and that should happen and whatever. And it's like, okay, there are more black people in the United States than there are Canadians, right?
And you would not make a sweeping statement about what Canadians think.
It would be a bizarre thing to do. And you know, as we know, like all different like ethnic groups, like racial groups, you know, groups based on sexual identity, like whatever, have, you know, they have a right wing, they have a left wing, they have like people who are completely apolitical, they have like religious people, they have atheists, they have, you know, there's like all sorts of different people within that group. So to say that I personally am going to tell you what this group thinks about any issue is like a deeply essentialist thing to do, which is unhelpful for trying to think through any issue. Now, that's not to say that people's positions can't be influenced or informed by their identities. In fact, I would argue that like all people like usually have some sort of like their positions are influenced by their identities in some way, right? So we're not trying to argue that like everyone should be like completely like neutral and there's like, you know, we should just be like these like robots who have no backgrounds, right? Because that isn't true. We're all embedded in social contexts that inform us, right? But I would say that, you know, there are like queer people who are extremely right wing. You know, and their right-wing politics, I'm sure, are informed by their sexual orientation in some way, right? And so to say that, like, you know, a queer politics is like XYZ, kind of like can really miss the point. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're obviously rushing through this. We have like an entire podcast episode that explains identitarianism, but basically the general premise is that it creates this way of relating in which people are, first of all, basically stereotyping, right? Like this is stereotyping, but it's like in a positive way, so somehow that's better, but it's like being like, I know what you think based on looking at you is a dehumanizing position to have. You don't know what that person thinks if you don't know them, right? And so you, like, this is something that the left used to fight against. We used to be like, stop stereotyping people, you know, understand that each person is a three-dimensional, complex human being that you actually have to talk to if you want to understand who they are, right? Whereas now, unfortunately, within social justice orthodoxy, we're starting to do this thing where we think having a list of someone's identities tells you essentially who they are and what they believe. And that is something that is stereotyping, even if we think we're doing it for a positive reason. So it's not a good thing to do. And instead, we should actually be treating people and communities and cultures as very complex and diverse, because they are. And so where this leads, the last thing I'll say about it, is that it leads to a situation in which people are not being responsible for what they believe and what their ethics are, because they think that they need to defer on these complicated political and ethical questions to people of specific identity groups, right? And so what you will get from this is you will have situations where, for example, you will have a white person say, I don't feel like it's my place to have an opinion about racism because I'm not impacted, so I will defer to what the BIPOC community thinks. And it's like, okay, well, who? Who are you deferring to? Because if you were to go and ask, or if you were even to do a bunch of reading, to read like major thinkers, who are racialized who have addressed racism. You would find that they not only have a diverse perspectives, but sometimes entirely opposing perspectives, right? So you actually can't defer. You actually have a responsibility to think about it. And I agree that thinking about it does mean exposing yourself to a lot of different perspectives, including, importantly, people who have different lived experience than you. If you're a white person who's going to try to form an opinion about racism, I definitely think you should be reading lots of thinkers. You should be talking to lots of people who have experienced racism. But you cannot just defer on the question and think that someone's just going to hand you a neat package telling you what to think. You actually have a responsibility to think deeply about it and to figure out what makes sense to you. And like, you know, that's scary and vulnerable because it's like maybe you could be wrong, or maybe you're going to change your mind about it, and or maybe people are going to disagree with you or not be happy with what you decide. But this is what it means to be responsible and to have integrity in our ethical and political thinking. And so where we want to go from here is we just want to point out that social justice culture, which is connected to cancel culture, because the connection is that if you are not speaking about things, if you're not repeating social justice orthodoxy, if you say something that is out of line, you can be canceled, right? Cancel culture is the enforcer. Cancel culture is what makes sure that people stay saying the dogma, the orthodoxy, right? And if you think and you say, actually, I've been thinking about this and I've been reading broadly and I've been having lots of conversations and I think something different, people can say, no, you're not allowed to think something different. And they can use identitarianism to back that up, and they can say, the fact that you're saying this now and that you're not backing down, we're going to cancel you.
And I mean, the question we want to ask the Humanist Society in particular is, does that remind you of anything? You know, if you're in a position where you are not allowed to have a viewpoint that differs from the orthodox one, on pain of being ejected from your community, you are in a religion.
Yes, and so this is the last kind of point that we want to make. Just checking the time. Yeah, we got a bit of time. Basically, what we are arguing is that social justice orthodoxy, or what we on the podcast refer to as the nexus, it actually functions as a religion rather than a politics. And specifically, it functions as a fundamentalist religion. And so what I mean by that is that if somebody is stating, you know, social justice dogma at you, and you ask them questions about it, or you disagree, it is actually not allowed. Like, it is not a discussion. And if you disagree or you start asking questions, you may be threatened. You may be threatened with cancel culture. And so this creates an environment in which people cannot freely think and cannot freely speak about what they're thinking about. And very importantly, it means, because I came to the left for politics, not religion. And so I want people to be thinking deeply about these questions. When we are looking at serious issues, like the dehumanization of people, like any sort of like bigotry, like what is going on with fucking capitalism and the climate crisis and all of this, I want all hands on deck. I want every single person showing up to these important political questions with the full freedom of their minds to think deeply. I want you reading broadly. I want you having conversations where you can like really unpack this stuff.
And not just sort of checking the equivalent of the Holy Book to see what it says that you should think, right? Which is essentially what people have ended up doing in social justice world, where we're just sort of like, oh, okay, this issue, like, I saw like a listicle that said that I'm supposed to think this about that issue, you know what I mean? And that is not thinking critically. That is not thinking critically at all. That is just waiting for other people to tell you what you should think, and then sort of like judging which of those people is the most like well qualified based on their identity to tell you what to think, and then going with that. It's completely handing over responsibility, right?
And yeah, like there's many examples of this, and we talk about it a lot more on the podcast, but like I will just give you one example that I talk about often. One of my favorite scholars, leftist scholars, his name's Dr. Adolf Reed. We recently had the honor to interview him on the podcast. He is a prolific scholar. He is an organizer, has been doing socialist organizing his entire life. He's in his 80s, okay? He is also Black and grew up in the Jim Crow South. So he thinks deeply about the question of racism. And he is a socialist, and his ideas are directly opposed to identitarianism and are directly opposed to the social justice orthodoxies that we've been talking about today. He, first of all, is a fucking elder, and people should show some respect, but he is constantly shouted down and silenced by millennials who say that his work is racist because he has a totally different understanding about how we should best address racism. And he actually had a talk canceled over like the pandemic because a bunch of millennial social justice kids decided, I know millennials aren't kids, but for some reason we think that we are, decided that he shouldn't be allowed to speak, you know? And regardless if you agree with his ideas or disagree with his ideas, what I can tell you is that he is a serious scholar, he's a serious intellectual, he is a passionate organizer who has been working and doing like socialist organizing since before I was born. He deserves to speak. And if people disagree with him, that's fine, but the idea that social justice culture now deals with these things by just shutting it down, you know, and labeling him as bad. And so that's a big problem for me in terms of actually many of the commitments that I see on this chart over here, right? Because this goes directly against critical thinking. It goes directly against like responsibility. It goes directly against having an actually like engaged and rigorous approach to social justice.
Yeah, and you know, like believing in something that you're not allowed to question is just another word for faith, right? Like, and I think that, you know, people in this room probably find that to be something that they don't want to be trapped in, right? I think that we've decided, many of us, that we have the right to think critically about anything that we want to, and that nobody can tell us not to think about something or not to say what we think is most accurate, right?
And so I guess just finally, I want to say, because I think people listening to this, it's kind of unmooring, because if you're in social justice culture and you've been following this stuff, and now we're saying, whoop, don't follow it anymore. People are like, how do I know that I'm not going to suddenly do things that are very hurtful or very offensive, right? How do I know that I'm going to be engaging in a way that is respectful to marginalized people, especially if you're not in the groups that are some specific marginalized group? How do you know that you're not going to do something hurtful? If you're not following this doctrine, what do you follow, right? And so it is more vulnerable to be out there in your own integrity, right? Because you might make a mistake. You might do something that hurts someone by accident. You might be wrong. But what we recommend as a different approach from dogma and from following rules is principles and developing your integrity and your responsibility, right? And so principles are extremely important. We talk about them a lot in the 12 steps. And basically, you know, they can be things like compassion, kindness, curiosity, empathy, tolerance. Those are some of our favorites, but there's lots. If you think for yourself about what your principles are, right? Then you can use those as a guide for your actions, you know, and you can see if your actions are in alignment with your principles, which means they're in alignment with your integrity. And so, you know, what I found is that when I was living in social justice culture and following all the rules, I started to realize that I was acting out of alignment with my integrity. Because I actually realized that when people were telling me to treat entire populations as a monolith, to treat entire populations as one thing, I understood that that was the same thing as stereotyping, and I understood that it was dehumanizing, and I understood that I would not want to be treated that way, you know? And so I realized that I couldn't continue to do that, and that would mean, for example, disagreeing with someone who I genuinely disagree with, even if they're grounding their argument in their identity. Because refusing to disagree with someone who I genuinely disagree with is condescending and is not treating them like my equal, right? And so this is how my principles and my integrity guided me to a different way of relating to this stuff.
Yeah, and again, like just to bring it back to the humanism, like because I think it's like a really interesting parallel. Religious people will often ask, like, if you don't believe in God, how do you be good? You know, and you know, they're like, well, if you're not going to go to hell, like, how do you know that you're not supposed to murder people? And I think that the response of humanists and, you know, agnostics and atheists in general is to point at these principles, right? And say, like, we have principles, like we know what good and wrong is, you know, like we're not imbeciles, like we're able to sort of like like look at the world and see like what is helpful and good for people and what isn't, you know? And like we're able to check our own behavior and be like, am I acting in alignment with my principles? This is like a basic sort of like moral exercise, or you could say an ethical exercise that unfortunately I think is not really like taught to people very much, because a lot of our sort of like ethical framework in North America is taught to us through the framework of religion, you know, and most people, at least in Canada anyway, like most people aren't religious anymore, so we're just sort of like unmoored and drifting, you know, and a lot of people like end up in if they're in that position, they end up in social justice world, because it's another world that offers you a pretty easy list. I mean, it's constantly shifting, it's pretty confusing, but in general, a kind of like easy list of things that you're supposed to believe to be a good person, right? And you can just like, okay, you're like, I don't have to do the work of deciding if I'm a good person or not, I just have to follow these rules, right? But unfortunately, that's not what makes you a good person. Following rules is not what makes you a good person.
Yeah.
Thinking for yourself and trying to figure out what is good and then acting that way is what makes you a good person.
And I think that, you know, if there's the lingering fear that you'll make a mistake, like I think that's very human, you know? And if your principles include having compassion for those who make mistakes, then you're okay, you know? Like it's in cancel culture that we learn that people who make mistakes are irredeemable. And like I feel like there's like a connection there with the idea of sin, right? Like this idea that you're bad. And people are really afraid of that, and so they want to be good. But it's like that is not a very good method for acting ethically in the world. And if your principles include things like curiosity, letting yourself like intellectually explore and try to figure it out, and if you trust in your integrity that you're like acting with good intentions and you're trying to behave in a way that's in alignment with your principles, then it's okay. And if you make a mistake, then you can learn from it. Like it's fine.
Yeah, so honestly, I think that's pretty much it for our presentation on cancel culture 101 and 102.
Yeah.
We have merch over there on that table. It's like zines that we've written, and we have some stickers. Zines are small magazines.
Yes.
And
Self-published.
yeah, and so if people want to grab those afterwards, like we'll be over there later. I think we're going to do like a question and answer session now. So yeah, if anybody has any questions.
Oh, there, we got one back there. Okay. That's why they give it to me, because they know I'm not afraid to trot in here. All right.
Thank you for coming, first off. So what's the best way to combat someone who's always putting down other people, and like where I work, it's all the woke people, and that's like they tout this garbage all the time. And like, so what's the best thing to say to them so I don't get fired, but also kind of tell them to like back the fuck off, you know? Because it's like all day, every day, and they are condescending, and they talk to me like I'm an idiot, and the superiority is just disgusting. So this was very enlightening, because I'm like, yeah, they definitely are not like going by principles.
So you're talking about, thank you. You're talking about a situation in which people are basically using the social justice orthodoxy against you. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're power tripping on you.
Because they're super.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a tricky situation because is this on?
It is, yeah.
Okay. It's a tricky situation because, you know, right there, like you're in a workplace environment. You're in a workplace environment, and so there is a very real power situation if this person has, like, you know, they're like your supervisor, you said, I think, right? So I don't know that I necessarily have an answer for that beyond, like, labor organizing, but, like, because that is real, you know? And part of the situation is that this culture has, like, a built-in mechanism against questioning it. Right? So if you come to the person who's a true believer in this stuff and you say like, hey, I heard these other ideas and like they make a lot of sense to me and like I would like to talk about it in good faith, you're probably not going to be met with good faith because this functions like a fundamentalist religion. And so when people are in a fundamentalist religion, they don't take well to people critiquing their ideas and instead use the functions of the religion to like shut you down, right? And so that's probably how you're going to be responded to. And unfortunately, like we could give you many like well-reasoned like arguments against what they're doing, but if they're not open to hearing that, then they're not open to hearing that. And because of the situation that, you know, you're in a power differential where they might actually have the power to really, you know, fuck with you, then it's a bad situation. I don't really have an easy answer.
Time to quit.
I'll try to
Yeah, I would say start a union. And if that's not possible, boundaries are good too. You know, it's just like it's really just a question of being like, if you're able, right? If this is not your boss or something, and if you're able, it's a question of being like, I actually don't like it when people talk to me that way. I prefer it if you didn't, you know, like, and pointing out specifically like the thing that is bothering, it's like, I actually feel like you just like called me a name, and I don't think that that's appropriate in a workplace. You know what I mean? Now that may or may not go over well, you know, but I can't think of like an easier sort of solution to the issue.
And I would say though, for most other contexts, we would answer this differently because it's the fact that it's basically like your boss or supervisor that makes it more complicated, right? But in general, you know, I think it's very, very important that people start to develop language about this stuff, and that we actually don't let these people take the left, you know, or that we don't let people who are invested in dehumanizing others, like, have the moral authority over social justice, right? And so we need language to actually challenge it and to be like, well, here are my principles, here's why I'm a leftist, or here's why I believe in social justice, and actually like the way that you're acting right now is kind of out of alignment with that for me. And that's like a lot of what we're doing on the podcast and like with this tour and like our writing and stuff, is we're trying to give people language to be able to talk about it, right? Because part of the way that it functions is it functions by never naming itself, right? Like it doesn't have a name. It doesn't name itself as an ideology. It certainly doesn't name itself as a religion. It names itself as the truth, as the ethical way to act, as the righteous, moral, and just way to act. So it's very hard to argue with that when people are positioning themselves that way, because they will just say that you're wrong and you're bad, right? But if you can actually say, well, there are other ways of thinking about this, and I think, you know, the Humanist Society, you guys probably have some experience with this type of conversation, where like there are other ways of thinking about it, and here are some of them. And so I do encourage that kind of conversation whenever you can, but a workplace might be a hard place to do it.
Alrighty, we got any more questions out? Yes, we do. We've got a couple here, so let's head on back.
I actually don't have a question. I have some perspective, if that's okay.
Sure.
My name's Dave, and I'm canceled, and to
Welcome.
thousands of anarchists and socialists across the country, I'm a monster. So I was a part of an organization in 2016 that made it its central mission to combat white supremacy in the United States by, weirdly enough, organizing amongst white working class people. It also involved firearms, and so based on that, I'm sure people know my background. And the thing is, hundreds of people know me, even though I've never met them, I've never talked to them, but they think they know my story and what happened with me and why I'm such a bad person. The perspective I want to offer, though, is one about the state. And for folks who are on the left, no matter what they think about me, I want them to understand something that did happen in the middle of this huge upheaval, in this middle of this huge cancellation, which was number one, an organization completely collapsed. A nationwide organization, nationwide network collapsed in on itself because anyone who's associated with me was a demon, a monster, and not anyone to be associated with. But secondly, the state became very heavily involved in this, and I'm really nervous talking about these things in this room. I avoid gatherings like this. I haven't been around a group of people like this in years. I've divorced myself from all of this.
You know it's recorded, right?
And that's fine.
Okay.
It's okay. I don't care anymore. So yeah, I guess I screwed that up, right? And I hate even talking about this because there's this thing that's been hammered in my head for the last 7 years. If I even talk about this, then I'm just making myself the victim and I'm taking away from other people's experiences. But I just want to be honest that in the middle of all of this happening, in the middle of my entire life collapsing and people trying to get me fired from my job and my kids literally being kidnapped and being a part of this weird trauma in this horrific way, which thankfully they're back with our family now. I was actually placed on a Quad S list, right? If you're familiar with the way that the federal government works, there is a Quad S list. And what that means is every time you fly, every time you try to transport yourself across state or country boundaries, you are then subject to secondary selection security status. And I was held by the US government on the border of Canada for many hours in a cell by myself, unable to contact anyone I loved. In the past, when that has happened, I knew I had a movement of people that would have my back, that I wasn't alone. But I was alone, besides my family and the committed friends that were here in Phoenix who had my back. And so in that cell at that moment, I can't think of a more isolating experience for anyone to go through, in that you no longer have a social movement to support you. If you need mobilization, if you need people to have your back, you're done. And then when they start to question you, they start to use this, right? Like my cancellation is on right-wing blogs. It's used to attack me. My cancellation has been brought up by the FBI in investigations of our organization or past organization. When they came to our house, it's one of the things they talk about. Oh, I guess you don't really have any friends anymore. It comes up. And they know you're isolated, they know you're alone, and they know you're vulnerable. And it's scary because any person in my situation, I think logically would have said, you know what, fuck this, I'm gonna talk to the feds, why not? Why wouldn't I give them information? No, none of these people have my back anymore. They've all gone out of their way to destroy my life. I might as well just fucking do it, right? And I haven't. And some people did, but I haven't. And I'm trying to hold on to integrity and principle, but it's really fucking hard. And it's super hard. And even, I'm sure there's people in this room who think they know me who have never met me in my entire life, never seen me, but they've heard how much of a monster I am. And that was a big rambling speech, and I'm so sorry, I don't know what to do with it, but it's on my mind. And I'm sitting here paralyzed to talk about it, and the only people who have heard me talk about it for years are these two in a bigger circle of people that we're with, but that's the only outlet I've had, you know? And so for 6 years, 7 years now, I've hidden in my house, and I've tried to go to work and keep my head down, and I was involved with social justice work for 20 years, and I've extracted myself from it because I can't do anything anymore. I'm a target by the left, I'm a target by the right, and I'm a target by the state, and I can't do anything. And my kids, my wife, my family, they all paid a lot of price for this, for what I involved myself in. So, and I'm not here to say I didn't harm anyone, right? But the problem is by the time it gets to this point, like you were describing this radical game of telephone, like what people think they know isn't reality anymore. And it starts to make you question your reality. Am I that monster? Did I do some of those things? Are those things true? And you don't even know what to do anymore. But as you're sitting in a cell on the Canadian border, you start to think, yeah, I'm a big piece of shit. So.
You seem cool to me, Dave.
I had something to say and I wanted to piggyback on it, which is just that like I really appreciate what you guys are doing because honestly, like us coming here was because of the things you guys have said in your podcast. You know, it was because there's people speaking out in a principled way, and that we on the left cannot even pretend to believe in something as beautiful and human affirming as prison abolition if we cannot put in even the slightest bit of work to recuperate the people in our own lives and social circles.
Yeah.
There's things that are incongruent. You have to be willing to do the work. And it is completely incongruent with the principles that we stand for to just treat people like they're disposable and we don't care if they're alive anymore.
Thank you.
I don't have anything insightful to say. I'm stupid. I have a question.
Okay, great.
So, on an organizational level, if you're in an organization or an organizer that sort of intersects with social justice, what are some ways that you can armor yourself and armor your organization against the nexus?
Yes, very important question. And this is sort of when I was doing these consults with like leftist organizers. Basically, there's no easy answer to any of this because there's no way to sort of like, anytime you challenge this stuff, you risk getting canceled, right? So there isn't like a safe way that you could like, if I had the magic key to be like, here's how you do it, but you're not gonna get canceled. Unfortunately, there really isn't any guarantee that you're not gonna get canceled, but I think that what we have to do is we have to start having language and talking about what it is, right? And why it is at odds with the goals of whatever organization it is. One thing that we got from 12 Steps that I think is useful here is the concept of a primary purpose, right? So regardless of whatever you guys think about AA, I don't know how many of you guys are secretly in AA or whatever, but AA is a fucking basically anarchist organization with no leaders that has been running since the 1930s, and they're all drunks, they're all crazy, and they have somehow managed to continue that, you know what I mean? And like, it's pretty cool. And so I think a lot can be drawn from the way that AA runs itself, but one of it is this idea of the primary purpose, right? And being like, what is the purpose of this organization, right? And for AA, it's to help alcoholics not drink, right? But for a political organization, what is the purpose, right? And in a similar way when we talked about the principles, the purpose can be like the guiding, principle of the organization. And then be like, is this behavior in alignment with that purpose? Or is it actually fracturing our organization and preventing us from actually fulfilling the purpose? So I think that's one way.
Yeah, and like related to that, it's also, if somebody is trying to be like, this person like can't be in this organization because, in like 2019, they like said something really like mean to my friend or something, and you're like, that is not related to the primary purpose. Like that is unrelated. Like, because what we're trying to do is stop, this company from like logging this old growth forest or something. You know what I mean? And so what this person said in 2019 is irrelevant. It doesn't affect the trees or the company, so we're not going to deal with that because it is not the purpose of this organization, right? And so I think like having a kind of stance that is like pretty firm around that is one thing. Another thing too that I think more organizations are starting to consider, although I don't know if any have like fully enacted it yet, is to have a strong stance literally against cancel culture and name it. Now this is like extremely dangerous because literally like on the left, if you even like if you even like say the word cancel culture, people are like, that's a right-wing dog whistle, you're a fascist, you know? But like it exists, and it's, you know, you can kind of be like, whatever, you can call it whatever you want, you can call it like disposability culture or like whatever, you know? Like some people have done that. But I think like naming it and being like, this phenomenon, which we are going to name and define like this, is like not in alignment with our values in this organization. And that's one way to sort of like get around that. And basically when people start getting cancel-y, you can just be like, read the sign, you know?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I thought I was gonna say something else, but it's okay.
All right, so real quick before, I know you had a question, but real quick before we get to it, I want to say something to Dave, right? Dave, my name is Cass. I'm with the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix. I want you to know, nobody in here gives a frick what your past was, because it's really all about where you're going next, my friend. So everybody in here, Dave, you are more than welcome to come join us any old time. I don't even know what you did. I don't care. I will never ask you. It does not matter to me even the tiniest bit, my friend. So thank you for coming out and joining us tonight. All right, onward with the questions. I know you had one you were waiting to get to.
Hi, y'all. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Jenny, and I'm such a fan of the podcast and of both of you. I had a quick question, which was, could you share some of the opportunities that you see for the left right now? Like, if you had an idea of like, oh, if the left would just embrace this, or, you know, not to essentialize and get, you know, here's the one thing that we should do, but what are the kind of places that are giving you hope in the left that you would like to share with us?
Well, I mean, we started this podcast, I guess, a little over 2 years ago, and you know, despite it being controversial, and obviously there's lots of people who get really mad at us and try to destroy everything that we do, there's also tons of people who are down, right? And we have watched a shift happening. We have watched more and more people being ready and willing to have these conversations. We are currently touring America. People are coming out to our events. You know, like, people are ready for this. And there are tons and tons of people who already were kind of thinking this stuff, but didn't have the language for it, or were just like way too scared to talk about it because they didn't want their lives to blow up. And so it creates this situation where you might have, you know, many people in the room who actually agree about this, and they're not talking to each other, right? And so we can't really create a cultural shift until we all start talking to each other, and that shift is happening. For me, in terms of like a vision for the left, like what I am obsessed with is the concept of solidarity. I want to see solidarity, and I feel like in social justice culture, we are encouraged to do the opposite of solidarity. We are encouraged to just constantly try to figure out why we can't work together, right? We need to figure out why we cannot be together and work together, and we're just like splitting hairs constantly and being like, I won't work with this person, I won't work with that person. And I'm like, guys, capitalists are running the world, and it's frightening because they're actually destroying the planet. And so if we want to have power that could effectively challenge these guys, we need numbers at a level that we have never seen before. And so, like, basically, like, my, like, very, like, basic way of talking about, like, Marxism is just to be like, you know, the workers rule the world because the workers make everything that creates the profit for the capitalists, right? And so that's the truth. We are the ones we are running this show. And it doesn't matter if you're, like, a factory worker or, like, you work for some kind of weird call center. Like, all of whatever kind of job you're doing, the profits of that are going to the fucking people who are doing all this crazy shit. And so basically, the way that we would challenge them is by organizing our labor power in a massive way, right? And I would love to see strikes. Like, I would love to see cross-industry strikes, especially about climate stuff, where we're like, absolutely not, you guys are destroying the planet, we're withdrawing our labor, you know? And I think that would be really fucking cool, and the only way to get to that kind of thing would be to be willing to work with people who we disagree with on many things, who we don't even like or get along with, right? And I'm just gonna briefly talk about the gays and lesbians for the minors. Yes. Because this to me is the vision of the left. And it was in the 1980s, guys. It's like 2023 and we've lost that, you know? But basically, for those who don't know, in the UK, in the 1980s, there was this thing called Gays and Lesbians Support the Minors. And this is the heart of my politics, okay? Basically, what it was is there was a bunch of minors who were on strike. They were on strike, they were organizing for their labor rights, and they were not working for a long period of time because they were striking, and so they didn't have money, you know? And they were trying to keep the strike going. It was a massive, massive strike. Then there was a bunch of gays and lesbians who were like in London, who were being queer, doing their thing, and they heard about the strike, and they were like, we want to support these minors. We want to help them with their strike. And many of the minors, as you might imagine, were homophobic. And they were homophobic in a way that is like much more severe than even today, because it was the 1980s, you know? It was very homophobic back then. And so like, these gays and lesbians were like, we want to go and support these minors, and they literally raised money for the minors, and they came to the minors and they gave them the money, and the minors were like, kind of like, whoa, what the fuck? Like, these are like perverts and queers, you know? But they really did need the money. And they were like, and the gays and lesbians were like, we're in solidarity with you. The police come to our community and beat us up, and the police are at your strikes trying to destroy your striking. So we're the same. And the minors were like, whoa, but they were like, okay, and some of them were more homophobic than others, but they worked together. And then, where this story fucking ends is that after a long period of time of the gays and lesbians supporting the minors, and yes, navigating homophobia, but being like, my solidarity is greater, and I see your humanity, and I want you to see mine, in the end, the minors, buses of them, came to the Pride Parade with a giant banner that said, minors support the gays and lesbians, right? And so, you know, we have this idea where we're like, we can only build solidarity once we have gotten over whatever weird, like, bigoted, fucked up shit that people have in their heads. But I'm like, that is the stuff that is designed to divide and conquer us, and it's not surprising that people have that in their heads. We've all been brainwashed, right? And it's like, we should all be actively unlearning that, but you know what's the best way to unlearn that? Relationships. Because it is hard to believe a two-dimensional stereotype about someone when you are working together towards a common cause and you are in relationships, right? And so solidarity actually is the antidote to bigotry. Because it's like when we work together, we see that we are humans and we see that we are in struggle together. And so like, that's what I want to see, that's my dream. Thank you.
I have a couple of ideas about like what is interesting on the left right now. Particularly in the United States, there's actually a wave of unionizations going on. Unionizations that could have been like, that were like kind of unthinkable even just like a couple years ago. So like most notably Amazon, Chris Smalls, represent Chris Smalls. Or shout out to Chris Smalls, I don't know why I said represent, I'm not Chris Smalls. Yeah, and like Amazon, like they spent like fucking like tens of millions of dollars to try to like crush this unionization drive, and they failed, right? Like Amazon is now starting to unionize a bunch of its locations. Starbucks, also amazing. There are Starbucks locations fucking everywhere, right? And they, you know, that it's a job that really should be unionized. And so I think that like the younger people starting to realize that their rights as workers are completely trampled in the United States, and to a lesser degree in Canada, are starting to realize that there's actually an option. There's something they can do about that. It's called a fucking union. And they're like, thanks for not telling us about that, you know, like it turns out there's such a thing, you know? And I think that that's a really important and really interesting direction for the left right now. A cool thing about unions is that they force you to, or offer you the opportunity to, be in an organization with people who might be very different than you, who might believe completely different things about politics than you, but who nevertheless share a common purpose with you. Common interest, right? A primary purpose, one might say. The other thing that I think about a lot is that right now, in North America, there's a massive wave of popular resentment against the elite. Now, for the most part, this has been weaponized very effectively by the far right. However, this is because the left has basically abandoned class politics. So this is like a really terrifying misstep that we have taken. And I think that the left needs to reclaim its traditional place as the people who advocate for the working class in relation to the interests of the ruling class, right? People everywhere can understand very easily that there's like a couple percent of the population who control 90% of the wealth and therefore control all of the economy. The economy that feeds us all, that gives us all the things that we need to survive, is controlled by literally like a handful of people, right? And the gap between us and them has been growing ever more steep since like, I don't know, since like fucking forever. It's been a while now, you know, that this has been going on and just getting worse and worse and worse. And, you know, the governments of Canada and the United States are pretty much just dedicated, like, like in their entirety to making this process of the rich becoming even more insanely rich as smooth as possible, and they have just proven over and over again that that is basically their only goal. And people realize this, right? People are not stupid, but they just don't have the language to talk about it for the most part. I think a lot of Trump supporting people who are like really like, you know, who would imagine themselves to be completely opposed to the left in all its forms are like one missing paycheck away from being fucking communist if they understood what communism was. And they believe that it's like the World Bank is trying to ban hamburgers or something. Whereas like what we're trying to talk about is like we need a labor party. We need a political party that represents the interests of labor, which we like do not have on this continent, and we haven't for a really long time. And so I believe that in conjunction with like labor organizing, I think that something that leftists in the United States should probably be working on is trying to build something that approximates a labor party that can get you guys, for example, fucking healthcare. Like personally, I'm just like, literally like every other thing that you're even thinking about, you should stop and like get healthcare because it's like really fucked up that you don't have healthcare.
We sneak antibiotics into the country when we come here because it's absolutely fucking insane what's going on here, guys.
So yeah, that's my answer.
All right, so I got we got time for a quick one here. Yeah. All right.
Hi, big fan of the pod, and I have a question about something that you guys have talked about recently that I have seen personally, which is the absurd phenomenon of cancelers posting your content, like doing this flip around where they're now anti-cancel culture. And I was wondering, like, do you think that it's even worth like sliding into their DMs being like, hey, just wondering, like, have you apologized to the people who you've harassed, or like how would you go about doing that without falling into the trap of like canceling the cancelers, right?
Okay.
There it is.
Thank you. Very important question. Yeah, so it's a weird phenomenon. It's happening all the time where very canceled people who I'm in contact with all over the world are contacting me to be like, yeah, the person who like destroyed my life is now sharing your work and has not in any way apologized, right? So it sucks, and I post about this, I talk about this, I encourage people to make amends to the people that they have canceled, right? To like say, hey, I'm sorry I blew up your life, and to make actions of repair wherever possible. That being said, I think, you know, your hesitation is an important one because we do not want to cancel the cancelers. We do not want to do the same kinds of behaviors because we are stepping outside of that paradigm, right? We don't threaten people, we don't dehumanize people, we do not try to force change by scaring people, right? We understand that people change when they want to change and when they have what they need to change, right? And so to me, like, I am hopeful that people who are sharing that, you know, that they are at least beginning to question it. But what we have found is that people have a very intense blind spot about their own behavior often, where they will be like, all of this is totally wrong, except for this time that I did it because it was very specific, and like all of these, you know, specific details that I know about it, therefore it's justified. It's like, I often make the example of driving, where it's like everybody's like, that fucking asshole cut me off, but then when they're driving, they're just like, I'm very important, I'm on my way somewhere, right? Like it's a lot harder to see it when we're doing it, right? So having compassion, having grace, to me, for that specific situation, like, it would depend on my relationship with the person. If it was a total random person who I just follow and I don't have a relationship with, I probably wouldn't say anything because it feels too much like the canceling thing of like sliding into DMs to like low-key threaten you, to be like, I know that you were a canceler, I'm watching you, you know? Like, we don't want that vibe. But if it was like a close friend of mine or somebody that I had a real relationship with and I was seeing that they were changing in this way, but I knew that they did have some amends to make, I might be like, hey guys, like, can we just talk about this? Have you thought about so-and-so? Like, and just see what they say, right? And then maybe try to encourage it. And, you know, hopefully if people are exposed to more of these ideas in time, they may make amends. But like, I always like to point out, you know, in the 12 steps, like step 9, that's when you make amends. That's step 9, right? And it's like, often it takes people like almost a year to get there. And so like, just because a person is in the place where they're starting to be like, okay, this is like what I did maybe was wrong, they might be quite a ways away from actually being ready to make that amends. And like, you don't want to rush amends because it's not going to be like a sincere good amends anyway, right? So it's just like, pray for them, I guess, you know?
All right, so I have a question for y'all, if I can. Hopefully we can get to it kind of quickly, and I know I'm blowing up time here. And then afterwards we have a little bit of closing comments for y'all and for the camera and whatnot. But anyways, let's get to it. It's kind of a bit of a challenge, a little bit of a pushback, but nothing too major. So you mentioned during your talk that it's unwise to sort of cancel dissenting opinions, and that the best way to engage with critical thinking is to just bring all opinions to the table and have those discussions, even when it is with people that you disagree with. And while I generally agree with that sentiment, I think, in my estimation, that there are times when we need to tell people, I'm sorry, you aren't qualified on this stuff. We're here talking about climate change and you want to come to the table and say it's not real. We're here talking about evolution and you want to come to the table and say the earth is 6,000 years old. I personally am of the view that some individuals don't necessarily need a seat at that particular table. How do we draw, where do we draw that line between being responsible in who we give a microphone to and not inadvertently canceling someone because maybe they have a dissenting opinion? How do we draw that line?
Yeah, good question. I think okay, here's the thing, right? Like if, let's say I was like trying to organize with like an environmentalist group and someone showed up and was like, hey, like I want to speak and like what I think is that actually we should cut down all the trees and replace them with parking lots because that's better. And they're like, climate change isn't real, and we should just, everybody should drive a bigger car. I think that like it would be reasonable for us in that organization to be like, okay, that is completely out of line with like the purpose of this organization.
Principles.
Yes, like it doesn't align with our principles and like and our purpose, So we would invite you to like sit and listen, perhaps. You know what I'm saying? But like we wouldn't be like we're gonna put your name on the internet and everyone you know is gonna be told to abandon you, and if they don't, we're gonna put their names on the internet. So like that would be the difference there. But and also I think the value of critical thinking in general is that like let's say I'm an individual and I'm trying to figure out what do I think about homophobia, right? Like I want to find out like what I think about it and like what's the best way to combat it and like is there some justification for some like homophobic things that someone has said or something, and I want to be like a real free thinker, so I'm gonna like look through it all. If I'm a good critical thinker, I can see people's arguments and be like, that argument doesn't make any fucking sense, it's based on bigotry. It doesn't compute, it doesn't hold up, and I think that it's useful to be able to look at ideas that we disagree with, even very stupid ideas, and understand why they are stupid, right? Like, it's a useful thing to be able to understand why ideas are stupid. And so I think that it's...
Sorry. There's a concept, sorry, are you done?
I'm done.
Apparently he's done.
I just tapped, because we're looking at me. There's a concept called illegitimate authority, or like legitimate authority, and I think this is relevant here.
Yeah.
If somebody were to walk in and say, hello, I'm a doctor, I would like to perform surgery on you, I would be like, can I please see like some paperwork, right? So believing that people should have the right to like think and speak freely does not mean that they have the authority to do anything anywhere, right? And so like different organizations need to make decisions about who they're including in decision-making processes, and that's fine. Like you can be like, for our organization, we don't want to have you because what you're saying is like not backed by science, for example. Like we're not backing the authority that you have. If they're like, my authority is like the Bible, for example, you're like, well, that's not an authority that we recognize in this space because we are basing it on science, right? But that is different, as Jay was saying, from being like, you're never allowed to speak or say whatever you want under any other context, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you for addressing that. So last thing we'll ask before we get to our closing comments, do you have any resources, websites, places people can where they can find your work, where they can get more involved, or recommendations for people watching this or for people here in attendance today, how they can participate more in trying to affect the positive change that you're striving towards?
Well, Fucking Canceled is the podcast name, so you can find Fucking Canceled on Spotify or Apple or like most places. So we really recommend you listening to the podcast because we talk much longer about all these topics on the podcast. We have an online store, which is fuckingcancelled.bigcartel.com, where you can like order our writing and our zines and stuff. And we also have a Patreon, which is patreon.com/fuckingcancelled, where we have like more writing. And then we're each writers, so we have our own stuff going on. Mine is, I'm Clementine Morgan, so clementinemorgan.com is like where you can buy my writing. And you want to say yours?
Yeah, and my writing is at jaylesoleil.com. And yeah, sometimes people ask like, well, okay, like now I've abandoned like social justice orthodoxy, but like I kind of don't know what to do anymore. Like I still want to like do like good things in the world, but I'm just kind of like stuck now. What should I do? And I told one person today, like, what you should do is like volunteer for a homeless shelter and join the least ridiculous socialist group that you can find. So I think that like that's a pretty good summation of what I think about that.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Before we wrap up here, everybody watching online, make sure that if you want to be more involved with cool events like this, you can find us Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix. On Facebook, we are on Meetup. That's where this event was posted. So we do all kinds of in-person stuff, virtual stuff. If you can't make it in person, still join us. If you want to become a member, hsgp.org. That's what I did, and it seemed to work out pretty well for me because look where I am now, Mom and Dad. So, once again, thank you so much to our guests from the fucking canceled podcast, Jay and Clementine. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We have a tradition here at HSGP. I don't know if anybody warned you guys when Kat invited you out here. Did she warn you that sometimes, every now and then, when people come to our center, they end up getting mugged? Did you hear about that? Kat, where are you at?
I'm over here.
Oh my goodness, prepare to be mugged, y'all!
I think there's another one under there.
All right. So we have a tradition of when we invite guests in, we like to present them with the HSGP mug as a way of saying thank you for joining us and for being part of the cool stuff that we're doing out here at the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix. Those of you joining us online, thank you so much. Those of you here in person, thank you all too. And have a wonderful night. Make sure you stick around, mingle.